Good evening, everybody. My name is Todd Schull. I'm the lead learner at the South Carolina Education Association Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. And tonight we are going to be talking about mental health. And after the events of that took place in Texas last week, I felt like it was really important for us to have a conversation about the mental health of our educators and their students, dealing with not just the issue in Texas, but what happened in Buffalo, what's happening in the Ukraine, and around the world. And we're just seeing so much violence, and I feel like it's really important for us to have a conversation about that. But before we dive deep into it, welcome to Paige, Selking, and Amanda Phillips from South Carolina NAMI. That's the National Alliance for Mental Illness. Did I get that right?
You did, yes.
Okay, great. And first of all, how are you guys doing?
Hanging in there, doing well. Adjacent to working in a school setting, so not quite in the thick of what everyone tuning in is probably experiencing, but happy to be part of the solution, but doing well in the grand scheme of things.
How about you, Paige?
For a minute, so I was trying to close out a bunch of tabs, so hopefully that will help. But could you repeat your initial question?
I was asking how you're doing. I wanted to just check in with both of you. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Clearly there's just, like you said already, there's so much happening in the world that can be really distressing. And so, overall, just some days I have to really force myself not to click through news articles because, it just becomes a lot. So yeah, that's kind of a combination of, hanging in there and also dealing with the same sorts of concerns that everyone else is facing right now.
Would you guys take a minute just to introduce yourselves, like your whatever you want to say about your bio? I've got them and I could read them, but I think I'd rather have you both just sort of tell us a little bit about yourselves.
All right. Do you want to start, Amanda?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Phillips, and I'm in Greenville, South Carolina. I am currently the project director for something called Refresh and Reclaim, which is a workshop and an education tool based on values-based healthy boundaries and self-care. So happy to be here. I have a master's and background in counseling. Not currently practicing, and have worked as a counselor in a high school. And my mother is a retired teacher, so big heart for our education people. That's me in a nutshell, I think.
All right. And I'm Paige Selking. I'm the Director of Youth-Centered Awareness and Education at NAMI, South Carolina. So Refresh and Reclaim, as Amanda mentioned, is one of the 3 programs that we have that is for youth and anyone. It's a wraparound approach. So really, it's parents, it's educators, it's anyone who has influence over youth. We really want to talk to them about their own mental wellness, signs and symptoms that maybe they need to get a little bit of additional support. And so that's kind of what our team does. And I came to working with NAMI and the mental health field because I have a husband and a child who are both combat veterans and deal with PTSD and depression and anxiety. So that was kind of where my journey started, and my interest in helping other military families started. And then that just kind of led, from one thing to another, and just really have a passion for helping people understand that we all have mental health. And that's something we're all going to need, those coping skills, because life is stressful. And so we may or may not have a mental health condition, but we all are going to deal with stress and anxiety. So that's kind of what our team has really adopted over that last couple years of COVID, is just how that's come to the forefront for all of us.
Yeah. Thank you both for that introduction, and thank you for what you do. What you do is so important, and the work that you do in helping to alleviate the suffering of other people is something that's really close to my heart and something that I'm trying to do through my work. So thank you for what you do. There's so much ground to cover. I don't know exactly where to start, but I think what I'd like to do given that the mission of the Center for Educator Wellness and Learning is to improve the inner and outer lives of educators, let's talk about the inner lives of educators. And a lot of times I've noticed that when the conversation is around these school shootings or violence in general, the focus is on the students, like what can we do for the students? And I do want to talk about that, but I'd like us to start the conversation with the adults in the building, with the educators, and what they can do for themselves. How do they take care of themselves? How do they manage? And when they hear this stuff in the news and they see this stuff and have to have that in the state of consciousness going into a building, what are some things that you can say to them? Either one of you can take this question. What are some things you can say to educators to sort of help them as they process this kind of news?
I'm going to kind of start off and then hand it over to you, Amanda, because this is really this is her area with her program, Refresh and Reclaim. But we were talking about this earlier and how we always hear the focus on the students. And clearly we know that educators care deeply about their students. That's not in question. But we know from past research surrounding, particularly at the beginning of COVID, when I was doing research on this, we know from past disasters, whether that's natural disaster, whether that's something like a mass shooting, anything that is a trauma experience, that one of the biggest predictors of how well students do or youth do, children do, is how well the adults in their life are coping with that stress. So that's one of the reasons why we feel you can't talk about how you are going to help students deal with the traumas and the fears that might be associated with shootings, with racism, with COVID, any of those types of losses or traumas that they're experiencing, unless you really talk about the mental well-being of the adults in their life, because that is a huge protective factor for how well children are going to handle these things and how much stress and anxiety and depression they experience. So that being said, I think that that's the place to start. It is important to talk about educators' mental well-being in order to talk about that response to the children that they teach every day. So Amanda, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this, so just cut me off if but just like you said, I did a quick Google search earlier today and have just been monitoring headlines about Buffalo and about Texas, and it is difficult to find a headline about educators that is not how teachers can talk to students, how teachers can talk to young students, older students. There is not a lot of content about how teachers what you can do for themselves, or even parents, any kind of caregiver. The focus is student and child centric. And just like Paige said, that is so important. But I'll talk a lot about emotional resilience and how coping can kind of be a tricky word, but I feel like now as a person who used to work in the education system, who's now removed, I feel like I can say this, but a lot of messages I see directed toward teachers are so focused on your students need you, you have to stay strong for the kids. And I think a healthier way to look at that might be your students actually need you first. The whole airplane mask analogy really translates here. So I just wanted to start off with kind of that validation first. Like, this is very difficult and very visceral because it's difficult. Like, this is hard because it's hard. And that sounds simple, but I think coping is a tricky word, because I think we hear that word and we think coping means we get to a state of feeling better, and not necessarily. I think coping just means this is how we, move forward or hit pause. It's not necessarily a linear process. So wanted to start off by talking about, there are scientific reasons why if this news cycle or this event, whether you had a direct personal connection to it, maybe you know someone who is directly, acutely impacted. The other thing I'll say is the only articles I could find about how teachers can cope were how Texas teachers can cope. And yes, educators in Texas might be affected in a different way, but teachers are a tight-knit community. So it's kind of like when one hurts, you all hurt. And there are reasons for that. So safety, I think, in case everybody's not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, safety is one of our core needs as human being. It is right above our need for food and water and shelter, those bare bones for survival. And safety is one step higher. And so right now that foundation of safety has a crack in it, because that's uncertain and that's in question. And promises can't quite be made there, which is terrifying because it's terrifying. So because safety is such a foundational importance, anything above that is affected by that, because it's now kind of an unstable place to be, right? So that, just to say, there's a reason, a biological inherent reason why this is so distressing. And the other piece of it, other than coping, the word grief pops up a lot. And grief doesn't just apply to the loss of a life, it can apply to any loss or change. So the loss of your sense of safety, it is supposed to be safe to go to work. It is supposed to be safe to send your children, to wherever. It is supposed to be safe and non-negotiable that it's safe to go to the grocery store. And again, those things are up in the air now. So there's overwhelm there, but wanted to say, there is no timeline for the speed at which you should be processing this. There is no correct or incorrect way, annoyingly so. I wish that there was a guidebook of, how to deal with this, how to feel better, but it's more about, I think, being open and attuned to what your individual needs are. So I have some actual practical tips. I promise, I just said there's no rule book, but educators are a tight-knit community. And right now, after kind of reading some quotes from teachers and speaking with a couple who are currently in the field, yes, I worked in a school and I know what it's like to work in a school, but not right now. And so no one knows how educators, nobody gets this except y'all. Nobody knows what it's like to be a teacher processing this except the teachers processing. And right now, I think the feeling is you're kind of at the mercy of people who don't even know what it's like to be in a classroom. Right. People are making these, and I don't know if you have more to say about that, Todd, but that's kind of something I found actually stated from a teacher on NPR, but I think that might sum things up a bit.
Yeah, so I've been doing sessions on mindfulness for educators for about 10 years, and one of the things that we talked about prior to the pandemic was that teaching was already one of the most stressful professions, and we talked about all the different ways it was stressful and how that leads to attrition. A lot of, I think that was like 44% leave within the first 5 years. So it's already a stressful profession. And then you added the pandemic on top of it, and the abrupt shift to virtual and or hybrid learning, and all of the potential things that went along with masking, and the sort of collective trauma we went through, seeing family members get sick or die, just worrying about getting it ourselves and not having the vaccine yet, and then the whole controversy around the vaccine, and then the politics, and then January 6th, and then it's like, and all this stuff, and then we go back into schools maybe before we feel like we should have, and they weren't requiring masks, and there's all this tension, and on top of the fact that education is already a difficult field, and then you go in and you add in, right at the end of the school year, where we're losing teachers, where people are saying they're going to retire early or leave the profession. You add in this, now I don't even feel like I feel safe. Mm-hmm. I think that this is a huge problem, that people are underestimating the suffering that our educators are going through. There are people that just want to dismiss it, but I don't think that if they haven't been in a school or haven't worked in a school, they don't fully appreciate the sort of crisis that we're in with a lot of educators in terms of their mental health, in terms of them feeling safe and not feeling anxious and overwhelmed and just burned out, just completely burned out. And that's my concern. And part of the problem in talking about this, and Paige and Amanda, feel free to jump in on this, but part of the problem in talking about this is when I go in and talk about mindfulness, or I'm sure if you've gone in and talked about self-care, the teachers are like, I would love to spend 20 minutes a day breathing or practicing self-care. I literally don't have the time, and there's so much on my plate. And then so they think that you're kind of placating them, just saying, yeah, now we're putting the onus of solving this entire problem on you. And so there's understandable pushback there. So I fear that they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater there, but
completely.
Feel free to jump in on that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Todd.
No, I'm done.
I was just going to say, and Amanda and I have talked about this many times, is validating feelings is such an important thing, and making sure that people understand, a simple fix. It's saying, we're understanding that you're in, I guess, be experiencing it, and not trying to come in and say, we're going to fix everything, because the reality is we can't, right? So the first thing is acknowledging the collective trauma that people are going through, and the results of that. Something that some of you may be familiar with, Bessel van der Kolk, who's an expert on trauma. And one of the things he said at the early stages of the pandemic was unpredictability is at a root of trauma. So you don't have to be somebody who was in Texas and in that school to experience the trauma. It's that unpredictability of, will this happen at my school next? And so that's a serious underlying thing that people don't necessarily acknowledge, because they say, you didn't experience that. Well, I'm experiencing the fact that I don't know what's going to happen when I go into school today. It's that sense of not being able to control it. And then the second thing is, they have known from research that whenever there is a trauma, disaster, whether it's a natural disaster or some other thing, that school has always been considered the stable, safe place in a community. And it's always been recommended that the school either stay open or get reopened as quickly as possible after a disaster in a community, just because of that sense of stability. Well, that's kind of being yanked out, isn't it? And school is no longer feeling like that safe, stable space. So I think that's a big part of it for us. Before we start talking about self-care, we need to acknowledge that we're not going to fix it. Those feelings are all very valid. And it's important for us to acknowledge that, instead of just saying, you do this and everything will magically be better. So that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda, because she deals with this in her Refresh and Reclaim, and really emphasizing this when she talks to educators.
Yeah, Todd, which the question you just posited is exactly where my job came from. We kind of invented my position and program as a response to, during the pandemic, we're working with high school and middle school students. We are hearing nonstop how burnout and exhausted and fatigued teachers are. And there's the snack cart, there's the teachers are superheroes t-shirts, there's, the capes and the things. All of the, first of all, I could go on about that can be a bit gaslighty. It can be a bit an override of any one or maybe all educators' actual reality, as, maybe an outsider's way of maybe trying to put a bow on it and make it not as horrible as it really is, when in reality, it's hard to, I guess, come to terms with it, especially when you can't have that organic empathy. And one of the things I really believe in is just checking in on each other before any of this even happened. But back to the teachers or superheroes and the snack cart, we just can't stop there, because all of the pep talks and self-care in the whole world that I throw at you is not really going to address the root of things like burnout, and this, existence or existential fear that's now happening because your core needs are in question. And again, that was true before the pandemic, because how many shootings and how many things were there before. So now it is very acute. And the run through you did, Todd, of all the things that have happened in the last just 2 years, talk about collective trauma and talk about a group of people who have not really been given the time or the space or have the energy to process it appropriately,
Right.
that they more than deserve. And that is, I mean, a bit of how my program came to be, because you don't have 20 minutes to do deep breathing on your planning period, because your planning period got taken away because of XYZ schedule changes and these extra things that have been put on your plate, because there are so many teachers out with COVID, and there's a sub, like, I could keep that sentence going forever. So kind of an approach that we offer is kind of a multimodal, I call it like a self-care menu of, hey, if you have 2 minutes and 0 energy and it needs to be like a free thing, what is something you can do? If you have an hour and a ton of energy. So just kind of a wraparound approach to how to actually take care of yourself, but by setting up a system of your personal boundaries. And honestly, half of that workshop is just validating, like, you have the right to have boundaries and limits, which is I think an important message for educators, because you've been hearing, from admin and for whoever who I think mean really well, but you've been hearing, the kids need you. You need to stay strong for your students. Maybe not in that exact language, but maybe feeling a bit overlooked. So yeah, I think, you think, Anson,
Yeah.
do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of want to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah. I was just going to say that I think what you're hinting at is this toxic positivity that educators have to deal with, which is you don't really have a right to be a human. You have to be, it's not okay to not be okay. When you go and you teach, you have to set aside your humanity. And what's layered on top of that makes it even worse is that we go back from a pandemic and we've experienced all this collective trauma. And the immediate shift is, well, we've had learning loss and we've got to catch the kids back up because we got standardized tests coming. And like the entire system is not built to meet the humanistic needs of the people in the building. It's to perform well on these test scores. And there's no grace, no kindness, no compassion afforded to educators. It's get back to the grindstone and focus on your job. And like you said, I think there's a lot of school leaders who they have good intentions, but by making an educator feel as though their pain and their suffering isn't valid, or that it needs to be checked and they just need to deal with that at home, I guess, with a glass of wine or whatever, that there's no space for them to process it during the day. And they have to like mask it and hide it, I think is so unhealthy and so detrimental. And I think it's one of the core reasons why we're seeing people leave the profession.
One of the best examples of what you're talking about I saw was a picture of 2 people in a school bus. One sitting in the driver's seat, and it was praising the principal and the vice principal, I think, were the two individuals for getting on and taking this bus route because there were no available bus drivers. And of course, everybody's like, oh, isn't this wonderful, kind of thing. And then one person started the conversation and said, no, this isn't wonderful. This is wrong. This is us saying we should praise them for doing something they never should be in the position of having to do. Let's solve the problem of not enough bus drivers. And I was like, on first look, it was like, oh wow, they're doing such a great sacrificial thing, you know, and then you stop and look at it and you go, wait, no, God's telling them they should be held up as heroes for doing something that is way beyond what they should have ever been asked to do. And so that just was really glaring to me when I saw that, and it made me stop and really think about it in a different way. And what is the message we're sending there? So I don't know. I think that's really important. But one of the things, Amanda, I kind of would like us to kind of talk about in relation to this is the fact that we've really tried to look at self-care from a way that we are not used to looking at self-care. Most of us, when we hear self-care, are going to think bubble baths, chocolates, massages, those kinds of things. And yeah, when somebody says that to me and I have a gazillion and one things to do, I'm like, yeah, right. Or maybe I don't have the money for an hour-long massage or whatever. So thinking about that, we have really tried to incorporate that into Amanda's program and say, let's look at self-care from a totally different lens than we've been taught to look at it. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, Amanda?
Yeah, I also wanted to rewind and say I don't mean to villainize admin because you know that there are directives coming at them too. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that, you know, there's different pressures coming from that way. And also the like retweet to the toxic positivity thing. And I'll get into emotional resilience. But I guess the synopsis of the workshop that we built for teachers is the first half is pretty much, hey, you know, validating you have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to say no to things you don't have time to do. You have the right to say no to things you just do not want to do. There's no award for the most PTO left on the table. You can take a sick day because your mental health is feeling overwhelmed. So just kind of those offering those permissions that maybe they aren't getting from inside the building for whatever reason. So kind of just building a lot of groundwork with that. Because those are not, you know, instead you hear you are superheroes, you can go above and beyond, you're capable of all these things that are like Paige said. So kind of rewinding and saying, lower the bar. You know, sometimes you have X capacity and that's fine and that's allowed. And then as far as how to set boundaries, with the idea that boundaries are typically in our interpersonal relationships. And a therapist and writer, Prentice Hemphill, one of her quotes we love is, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me at the same time. So kind of how to protect relational health while we're going about our day to day. And what a great tool to give our educators, you know, we think. And so we talk about, you know, how to set those up, but mostly why it is so important to do the very, very difficult work of figuring out what yours need to be based on what are the most important things to you on the planet, and who do you need to ask for what. So I could go on another tangent about that, but so boundaries are kind of the infrastructure, you know, maybe it's, hey, I actually don't answer work emails after 6 p.m. So here's me when I'm back in the classroom responding, or hey, I actually leave the building when my contract says I can, which is, you know, and if so-and-so down the hall thinks you're the laziest teacher in the whole world for doing that, they get to think that. And, you know, they can process that on their own while you live by your boundaries. And even setting the bar at an approachable place, like maybe you say, I'm going to leave the building at, you know, that time every day, but you do it once this week instead of 0 times. That's still, you know, a progress point. So it doesn't need to be yet another thing to pile on and try to be great at instantly. I call it kind of low bar lifestyle. Really don't shoot for the stars, like shoot for, you know, what you can shoot for, if you will. But the second half of our work with educators is flip that idea of self-care on its head, because so often it is only given as a kind of a reactionary triage tool. You know, you have hit that human version of iPhone low battery mode, you are at 8%. It is kind of a dire situation. time for some self-care, when actually we believe that self-care should be preventative and done ahead of time and a regular piece of your life. And the analogy we bring in with that is, think about brushing your teeth. You know, it is not the day you get a cavity and you're at the dentist's office, he says, here is your toothbrush, time to brush your teeth. We do it twice a day, every day, before we can even hold the thing by ourselves in our hand. So how can we redesign how self-care looks in each of our individual lives? Because that's going to look different for everyone. How can we redesign it to where it can be as acceptable and almost kind of automatic, I guess, as something like dental hygiene, which is still part of self-care, you know, your physical body, but there's so much to it. So how can we just kind of shift that paradigm, as well as self-care can be anything you need it to be. So kind of teaching the model that whatever in your life is causing that kind of black cloud of dread over you, that is a thing you have the right to attend to, whatever it may be. It might involve something really uncomfortable. You know, if I'm behind on a deadline and I'm stressed and I'm you know, upset and worried, I really don't want to call my boss Paige and say, hey, I'm stuck, I'm behind, this might not happen on time, whatever. But doing that really uncomfortable thing is what's going to attend to my distress most immediately. So kind of doing the inner work of what is causing the strain, who do I need to ask for what to stop it, rather than the narrative right now, which seems to be push past it, you're an overcomer, you're capable of more than regular people are capable of. And they can, self-care can truly be anything. I mean, the example I have is, it was just tax season and I am a procrastinator and it was getting closer and closer to that deadline. And so one day my self-care was, Amanda, you are in this chair until TurboTax is submitted. You would never expect me to come on here and say, doing your taxes is self-care. So that, I hope that kind of widens the range for what self-care can look like, which is an inefficient system by design.
Yeah, I think
And I'm going to add that one of our people during one of talking about self-care, and she said, self-care for me right now is having my groceries delivered. And it was like light bulb moment for me. I'm like, I would never have thought of that as an act of self-care, but she's a caregiver, and in the course of her day, going to the grocery store and taking that time and that energy was just overwhelming to her. So spending that little bit of money to have her groceries delivered was an act of self-care. So that kind of changed my view on a few things. I used to be so upset that I just didn't have time or the energy to cook or really like it that well. And then I encountered Costco this last year, and I'm like, they have amazing pre-cooked meat. You know, I did pre-made meals. I just pop in the oven and it's great food. That's kind of a self-care thing for me, because I don't have to stress over making that meal after I've put in, you know, a 10+ hour day. And so that was huge for me to realize those are acts of self-care. Yeah. Because it made my life easier. It made my staff members' life easier with her grocery delivery. And we all just need to think of it outside the box.
I agree. And I think that's such an important thing. Learning to say no is such an important part of self-care. A lot of people think it's like adding things to my plate that I have to do. Now I've got to meditate. Now I've got to exercise. Now I've got to find time for a bubble bath and go buy chocolates. And, you know, like, and I think starting with where are the boundaries and where can I start saying no? And one of the problems that educators have, especially in this state, in right to work states, and I don't want to get too political here, but in these states where they feel disempowered to say no sometimes to a leader, saying no, I don't want to do that. No, I'm not coming in today, and I'm sorry that you're short staffed, but that's not my job's not the staff of the building. My job's to take care of myself. I've got sick days. I want to take one. The problem is that when a teacher does that in isolation, a lot of times what they face is a community of other people telling them they're not putting their students first, they're not putting their kids first. Mm-hmm. And so then there's this incredible pressure not to say no to anything. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying, what we're trying to say at the SCEA is, one of the important reasons of joining our association and building collective power at the local level is so that it's not just one person saying no, that you can get together as a school, as a faculty, and say, these are the things we're going to say no to. And you're not going to fire us all, but we're going to start saying no to things, or we're at least going to have a conversation about how we can compromise on this, because we're all overwhelmed and burned out, and we've got to figure out some things we can say no to. And imagine an entire district of teachers doing that with district administration, and doing that collectively under the umbrella of the SCEA, who is going to have your back. So this is why it's really important for people not to feel like they're isolated and doing this in isolation, that they can get together collectively, organize, and push back so they can say no. I think that's critical.
Yeah. And
I think the other piece of that is no is a complete sentence. We have been really, that's a big thing for us, because my husband always gets after me and he says, you know, when you say no, because you've just given them something to overcome, an objection to overcome, or an obstacle to overcome. And I'm like, yeah, that's so true. And you can't always do that clearly when, you know, in work situations and stuff. But I think it's also us giving ourselves permission to say no, just because we're saying no, not because we have to come up with some excuse for why that's valid. It's valid because we said no.
And that's such a countercultural thing. You're right. And I mean, like I've seen it get to happen in pockets. I think one of the workshops we did was with a whole school staff, and a couple of them got to chatting and said, hey, like, actually, like, I need to have your back on that. Why don't we get together after this and meet? So, you know, I'm inspired by seeing that. And, you know, sometimes that's not happening. You know, that isolation might be a reality, or they might not have found that yet. And something we kind of have as an answer to that even is, you know, a workaround. If that obstacle is not going to move, where else in your life can you take a step back and say, okay, well, what am I going to adjust to kind of allot for that? And just trying to find as dynamic an approach to all of this as possible, because there's just not a prescription, because every building, every district, you know, every department maybe has its own unique and valid challenges. So, I mean, it's just like,
I wanted to share with you. So back in, I guess this is probably like 2001, I was struggling with anxiety, and I didn't like the idea of going to therapy. I didn't like the idea of taking any kind of medication, and I was trying to deal with it myself, and very unsuccessful. I had just become a father for the first time. I was in I think it was my 6th or 7th year of teaching. I was overcommitted to coaching and just doing a lot of things, and just became overwhelmed and had these issues with anxiety. I eventually broke down and went to therapy, and found it very, very helpful. And then found mindfulness through my therapist, which is why I've been promoting it so much, because it was one of the critical pieces to my recovery. Can you talk to the educators out there who may be thinking about therapy, but for whatever reason it's stigmatized in their own mind, or they're worried about what it would be? Can you talk to them about the importance of therapy, and how and why therapy can be such a critical part of helping them address their stress?
Yeah. First of all, well done on allowing yourself to, you know, embark on that, because talk about another thing that's countercultural. I'm a person who lives with multiple mental health conditions, bipolar type 2, and anxiety disorder, and PTSD. And the day I got that diagnosis, I was a grad student in my counseling program, and my internal world was kind of like, oh no, that's a really scary label. How are people going to react? But internally, it was more of a, hey, this actually explains, you know, and this has a name on it. There can be a pathway to a solution and to wellness now. But when I became vocal, like, there was some discrimination. So like, that is out there, and it's horrible. That was, you know, 10 years ago or something now. And I feel like it's come a long way. But I guess wanted to start with, any human being on the planet can benefit from therapy. You don't have to have a diagnosis at all. I wish everybody would go to therapy, just because it's truly the only truly objective environment I have in my entire world, where it is just kind of a space to lay everything out on the table with a person who helps me sift through and decide, hey, what's a negative message coming from wherever that's not actually true, who has no bias and who has no agenda, and nothing to push, just kind of that facilitator. And I think about it like a soundproof room. Almost there's no other noise, there's no other influence. And I like to think of it as what a luxurious gift to give yourself. Because I don't really think that space exists in the same way anywhere else. And on the point to stigma, if that is something that you are thinking about embarking on, I guess kind of two things. If that's something that you feel like is sensitive to speak to the people around you, you get to decide, if they know about that or not. Whether it's you were diagnosed with something, you are just really, really struggling, you're going to therapy, medicine, you get to decide when to tell who, and kind of checking with yourself on if there's a negative reaction, will that be a safe environment for me? Will I do okay? I make a rule where anything sensitive about my mental health, I'm very transparent and very vocal, but I've, been fortunate enough to have a job and a family that there's really no backlash. So that hopefully can make vulnerability a bit contagious, but sometimes those relationships, aren't there. So it's okay to protect that, and kind of, divulge it as you see fit. But if you are in a place where you are able to talk about it, what that's such a great thing to do. I can't tell you how many messages I've gotten, from educators when I was a counselor, even saying like, thank you for talking about this, or hearing you talk about how beneficial therapy's been, that got me to go. It made it less like icky and strange. So kind of that protect yourself, and vulnerability as it's safe, kind of I guess like it's my combination answer to that. But I'm a big fan of therapy. I'm a big fan of my medication. I used to feel really embarrassed about it, but then one day it was kind of like, if I had a heart problem, I would take medicine for that. And the only difference is it is a different organ system in my body.
Right. That's why I felt when it first happened, I felt like I had to hide from people that I was in therapy, hide that I was on medication, because it felt like some kind of personal failing or weakness or something that people would think I was weird. And it took a little while for me to get comfortable admitting to people, hey, and then it was liberating. It was very freeing to be able to do that. And then I feel like if someone wants to judge me for it, they can judge me. But I think much more often, my ability to be vulnerable allows other people to open up and be vulnerable themselves. And maybe they don't feel so strange in what they're dealing with.
And I would just add, don't rush.
Sorry, go ahead.
I would just add, don't feel like you have to rush to that. And that's kind of the same thing I would say about educators being asked about Texas or about gun violence. Don't feel like you have to rush to that place where you're able to be that mouthpiece, because there are other people who are like already at that point. So your job is to focus on your process and get there when you are truly organically in a safe place for that to be authentic, because there are people who are just ahead on the objective timeline. Not that it's a race by any means, but there are people who are in a safe place to do that now. So you can take your time to get to yours.
And I think it's interesting when we just kind of don't feel like we have to hide it. As Amanda said, you don't necessarily have to go shout it to everyone. You need to feel like it's a safe space to do that. But, I'll call somebody for something that, maybe work related or whatever, and they find out what I do, and they're all of a sudden like telling me their story, their family story, their experiences with mental health. And it's like so freeing, because they're like, oh, I feel like I can share something with you and you're not going to judge me. And I think the more that we kind of make ourselves available for that, make it known that people aren't alone in what they're experiencing, that people oftentimes feel a sense of relief and they want to share and they want to know what your experience is, because they've never really realized that it's other people, are experiencing this as well. So that's just been an interesting thing that I've noticed in this job. I'm like, okay, didn't really want necessarily expect to get your life story about your, your experience with mental health or suicide, but they needed to share because some of them say, I've never told anyone that before because I just didn't feel like it was okay to. And the other thing with what Amanda was saying is in our Ending the Silence program, we really, really emphasize, getting rid of some of the myths about mental health. You're talking about, weak character, whatever, and really emphasizing this is a medical condition like any other medical condition. If you break your leg, you go get it cast or whatever's needed to fix it. If you have high blood pressure, you go get medication to lower it. And so really trying to get people to understand there is no shame because it is a medical condition and we should treat it as such. So that's a big message. That's also why we talk about we all have mental health. We talk about we all have physical health. We hear from the time we're little, you eat right, you sleep enough, you get physical exercise. We don't talk about the fact that because we all have mental health, if we have a brain in our head, we have mental health, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to treat it exactly the same way. Get those coping strategies, get all of those tools we need because we're going to face stress, we're going to face anxiety. And then that also helps us know what do we do when we have that? And then when is it time to maybe go and get a little additional help, whether that's therapy, whether that's medication. We know those signs and we know when it's time to maybe seek that professional help to deal with whatever's happening.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask this question, and I'm hesitant to ask it, but I want to.
I'm intrigued.
It's important. I think it's an important question, and I ask it in humility. So we saw in South Carolina, we had a shooting. A young person was shot and killed at Tanglewood Middle School. We then had the Buffalo shooting, and we then had this shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and there's a lot of back and forth on social media about how do we address this. And there seems to be two camps. One camp is it's all about gun control. Another camp, it's all about mental health. And I've kind of taken a position that I don't think we have to, it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. We do need to look at what are the unique sort of data points and criteria that are causing this. And I don't want to get into necessarily gun control debate, but how would you respond to people who the mental health aspect of how we address this gun violence in America?
Mm-hmm. I try to, when I'm speaking with anyone, I try to keep things, factual. So as a mental health advocate, I feel like something that might be my job to highlight is, if we look at certain statistics, such as, the United States is not a leader in mental illness and mental health, quote unquote, problems. We're a leader in, instances of mass shootings. So kind of, I'm big on the scientific process and when it's appropriate to make a correlation. And so trying to kind of humanize the idea of, how often is mental illness specifically villainized and isolated out of the mental health spectrum? And if you see a movie, there's a villain and they have some kind of, mental health thing that is really exacerbated. And, it could go on about that all day, but I think just the idea of, I'm a person with a mental health condition. And, I was super fortunate to have a family who believed me when I said I needed help to take a break from college, which meant I lost some scholarships. Like, I was very privileged in my journey to have support. That's not everyone's reality. So just kind of, you just never know. Any human could run into some kind of mental health crisis. So I kind of just tried to humanize it a bit. And I'm happy, use myself as an example. If, I hadn't had the same family that I do, would my story have been different? And just statistics such as people with mental health conditions are statistically more likely to be a victim of violence. It just so happens that, hey, we have headlines that grab onto certain things, and I don't want to get political either, but certain headlines with certain verbs and words get more clicks than other ones. And sometimes that's at the expense of the mental health, community. And that's hard to watch as an advocate. But Paige, do you have anything you want to add to that?
You summed it up pretty well. As Amanda said, statistically, mass shooters do not, have a mental health condition. And the vast majority of people with a mental health condition are more likely to be victimized. And this will probably be a little bit political, but I don't even remember his name, to be honest. But it was either a senator or a representative. One of the best quotes I heard was, "We are not an outlier in mental health conditions in the United States." So I think, and then he goes on, of course, to say we are, in the number of guns that we have on the street. But it was that point of, we aren't the world's leader in mental health conditions. So clearly, there's another causation, since we are experiencing these things and yet we don't have a greater prevalence in mental health conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that fully answers,
Yeah, it does. I guess.
I was going to play devil's advocate for a second, if that sounds like fun. I think that these kinds of debates on such a public stage, not meaning this Facebook Live, meaning like CNN, it can almost be a cause of the overwhelm, because we can't necessarily reach a calm, happy, closure-giving solution. And that kind of distracts from the whole thing we gathered to talk about tonight, which is, how do we actually cope with this, though, in a way where we can have some kind of impact on the outcome for, specifically in this case, for educators. So I don't know if that messes up where you're going next.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I've been wondering how to appropriately respond in those types of conversations. I don't want mental health to be diminished, the importance of mental health, just from a perspective of how do we help educators and students cope with seeing these things, just from that perspective. Mm-hmm. But also, how do we also maybe it's not mental health, maybe it's something else, where how do we help young people to where violence isn't an option, where they don't go to violence as an option, no matter what the cause, whether it's not mental health, then it's some type of societal issue. How do we do that? But I'd like us, since we only have 10 minutes left, I do want us to take a minute, because I put it in the description. I do want us to take a minute for you to talk about how educators, how parents can talk to young people about these events in ways that help them in a healthy way move through it, without like just avoiding the topic.
Well, I would say one thing real quick, Todd, is social emotional. Obviously, we deal with mental health, but they're very closely connected. And, how do we help, guide young people, adults, frankly, how do we steer them from reacting in violence to reacting in a positive way? Because we all have anger, we all have things that we're not happy about, or we feel are unjust or whatever. But, the real key is teaching, empathy, teaching people that emotions are not a bad thing, even anger is not necessarily a bad thing. What we have to do is learn how to cope with those feelings, learn how to acknowledge them, learn how to appropriately deal with those emotions that we're all going to have. And I think that's at least a start to getting us directed away from reacting in violence when something doesn't go our way or whatever. So I think that's one big thing. And then before Amanda jumps in with a little bit more on talking to kids, kind of going along with that, how the parents and the caregivers are doing really has an impact on how children are reacting. They found after 9/11 and after the earthquake in Chile in 2010 that children and youth felt like if they had a supportive caregiver who was willing to talk to them about their experiences, what they were feeling in connection with the trauma they experienced either firsthand or even, watching it in the media, and experiencing it that way, that when adults were willing to talk to them about it and how they were feeling, that also helped them lower their stress and their trauma reaction. So I think that's a very, very beginning key, is we've got to be willing to talk to kids about how they're feeling and what they experienced.
And I think, that can feel like a lot of pressure. But you as a parent and or you as a teacher probably, I'm not either, probably feel a responsibility and a duty to address this directly somehow with your younger people, whatever that looks like. And I guess some of the tips I want to give are twofold. It is so important to make sure that if you are co-processing something like this with another person, do you have a space protected where you can raw process it? Whether that's talking to another educator, talking to another parent, talking to a counselor, whoever. That's not always a luxury everyone has. So trying to protect the space where you can do that for yourself first. But just a few, I want to talk about emotional resilience and kind of interpersonal boundaries a little bit, I guess, but suppressing your feelings and kind of swallowing it to like look strong, it can be a temptation, but what's I argue more valuable than that is teaching our kids that the entire spectrum of emotions is valid and they come up and all of them are important and none of them are bad or negative. Feelings come up for all of us. It's a question of what we do with them. So kind of for you, the caregiver or teacher, saying, pay attention to how you're doing and how you're feeling, your thoughts, keep tabs on how you're responding to information and when you might need to take a break. And it is okay when you're talking with, my biggest message is do that for yourself first, care for yourself first, because our students our kids are not really in a position to return that in the same way that maybe we would be able to for them. But when you're talking, whether it's a family member or whether it's a student in your classroom, I think the best advice is to stick to the facts that are developmentally appropriate. Some children are ready for certain details, and others, maybe younger ones, are really just needing a macro level, synopsis, and that's all that they're ready for. So kind of paying attention to where they might be in that level of readiness. But it is perfectly fine. And I argue a good model to be honest. Hey, this is hard because it's hard. This is really scary because it's really scary. Ask how they're feeling, give them the space to voice that and say, like, and validate that emotion and offer them that empathy. Like, yeah, this is really scary. It scares me too, and offering that model of presence and empathy, like, hey, I'm here for you if you have thoughts you want to talk about, kind of identifying yourself as where to come with them. And that can feel scary and that can feel like a weakness, but just reminding yourself of that is how just swallowing our negative things that we feel strange, maybe modeling to children, like they're going to be in there and they're going to accumulate and they're going to come out somehow. And that's certainly not the most psychologically healthy tool that we can give the people around us. So it's not a weakness to emote and be scared and to show that. Maybe they don't need to know the full intricacies of it, but it's okay to say, hey, I'm scared too, and it's because it's scary. How are you feeling? And so do that with your peers, your other educators too, is a great thing. And we've already talked about self-care. Set the boundaries that you need. You don't have to engage in this topic if on that day or in that moment you don't have the bandwidth for it. It is more than okay to say, hey, actually, I just don't want to talk about this right now. And if someone thinks that that's rude or dismissive, again, they get to think that it's your job to protect yourself, and they can regulate too. So just make sure you're paying attention to where your bandwidth is for the topic. And you don't have to, and there might be, certain people in your life where that this is going to be a hot topic. They're going to bring in a Second Amendment debate. You don't have to engage with that person at all. Actually,
I told Amanda I had to actually block my own father for about an 8-month period because he's got some really extreme beliefs, and it was really bad for my mental well-being. Every time he would send a text with something he knew was going to be really opposite of what my personal beliefs were, and I didn't want to engage because it was just more upsetting.
Yeah.
And so my daughter and my husband kept saying, you need to block him. He's really hurting your mental well-being. And I felt guilty. I'm like, that's my father. And then finally one day I just had to say, enough. This is about what's important for me to be healthy. And I didn't even tell him. He may have figured it out, but maybe not. I don't know. But I'm like, I just have to do it and not worry about the fact that this is my dad, and that feels totally impolite.
Well, and just, his anybody else's emotional regulation, that's an inside job. You're responsible for yours. You can't stop, and it's not your job to stop another person from feeling disappointed, because it's back to that emotional resilience spectrum. But setting these boundaries right now might feel so radical, but what is maybe on the other side of that is if you don't set them, think about what's the cost of not doing that. Like your mental health is so worth having that uncomfortable barrier, whether it's temporary or permanent. Your mental health is that important. It is worth that uncomfortable conversation. Like that is, your mental health affects everything you do. So it is that valuable, but that's not the message in society. But here we are to hopefully give that permission slip, and hope that can be kind of taken tonight as an immediate application. Your mental health is that crucial.
I know we're pushing up on 8 o'clock. I'd like to ask you one last question, and you can answer it as quickly as you'd like. If you could have an audience with our policymakers at the State House and make one recommendation for mental health in our public schools, what would that be? Pay
teachers a lot more money. Where I'll put a period on that. Talking about the root of the burnout, and where certain modeling comes from. Students pick up on stress, but that doesn't mean, the onus gets put on teachers to control that. But, that would be what I would say. Pay teachers a lot more money.
I would agree with that. And then also add on to there, making sure that it is safe in school to talk about mental health, that it's actually considered an important topic, that we put money behind it with, pay for teachers, that we make services available for educators as well as the students, and basically just say, academics are important, but if you don't have mental wellness, you're not even going to have the same level of academics, because mental wellness it affects every part of our life, including cognition. What I would say is let's fund what we need to, teacher pay, and more services, and focus on mental health.
Yeah, I'm happy to tell that to any lawmakers. So give them my info,
Yeah. And I'd love to see therapists in the schools, not only for the students, but staying after school for the educators, so that they have that immediate access and it's easier for them, instead of having to go home and change and then drive out to a therapist and try to figure it out in their schedule. Just be able to stay right after school and go. That'd be great. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It was a really wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. I know that the folks who are watching learned a lot as well. It was a really great conversation, and one that, I'd love to have a part 2 to this at some point, but there's so much more to cover. Before we leave, could you give folks who are watching, like, how they can get in touch with you and connect with your organization?
So if you're interested in the program that Amanda is the director of, and we will do that right now, that one is just for adults. So whether it's community members, parents, teacher groups, they can contact her at refreshandreclaim@namisc.org. Or just go to our website, namisc.org, and you'll go to the youth-centered page and you will see our 3 programs and how to connect with each of those if you're interested in bringing those to your church, your civic group, your school, anything like that. We will talk to anyone who has anything to do with youth and the adults who surround them. So,
and we have people peppered, in different parts of the state, where wherever you are, we will just fill out the info contact form on the website, and we'll connect you with, whoever can meet your need or request. So just hop on the website, and we are here to do whatever we can.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to Paige Selking and Amanda Phillips from NAMI, South Carolina, and yeah, so much wonderful stuff here that we covered tonight, and I appreciate your time. And for those who are watching, if you're interested in joining the South Carolina Education Association, head on over to jointhescea.org. We would love to have you as a part of our movement. And if you'd like to learn more about the Center for Educator Wellness and Learning, it's cewl.us. That's cool.us, cewl.us. We'll be posting this webinar to that website, along with a bunch of other resources for you to check out that are related to these topics. So once again, thanks to Paige and Amanda for being here tonight. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.